Okay, it's 12 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ileana Soto-Welty, and I'm the Executive Director of MECA, the Multi-Ethnic Collaborative of Community Agencies. We are excited to be launching today the first in a three-part health equity series. Today's topic is Racism is a Public Health Crisis. Please join us and sign up for the second and third sessions on Eventbrite, which are entitled Health Equity and the Social Determinants of Health and Addressing Structural and Systemic Change to Advance Health Equity. We have the pleasure of having some amazing individuals with us today, including Dr. Miguel Gallardo, who is my co-moderator and Director of Research and Evaluation at MECA and Professor of Psychology at Pepperdine University. We have Dr. Clayton Chow, Healthcare Agency Director and Public Health Officer. Kieran Savage-Sangwan, who is the Executive Director of the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network. Jennifer Wang, Chief Operations Officer at Asian American Senior Citizens Service Center, and Dr. Della Mosley. Before we get started, I wanted to share why advancing health equity is important to us. MECA's mission is to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities, in particular health disparities. We wanted to create a series that began to align and connect efforts and have us discuss the intersections of public health and behavioral health, as well as how the social determinants of health and adverse childhood experiences affect those groups that are most impacted by trauma and the toxic stress that racism especially causes. As individuals, we simultaneously experience oppression and privilege in our daily lives, interpersonally and systematically due to race, class, gender, and other aspects of our identity. I personally feel like we are experiencing this more blatantly now more than ever. We know that about 75% of our overall health is determined by social factors, and racism is a key factor in determining people's health outcomes. Over a year ago, the killing of George Floyd made an impact worldwide, causing us to reflect. Coupled with the pandemic, it highlighted disparities and racism in our communities. We've seen how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted vulnerable communities, especially BIPOC communities, in many ways. All this is a catalyst and a call for change, and that we must take this moment and turn it into a movement. My hope is for us to all join this movement, have these deeper conversations, and collectively be a force for change. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Miguel Gallardo right now to get us started in today's conversation.
Thanks, Ileana. Just want to just express my appreciation to the speakers, panelists today, and also just the enthusiasm around us having these workshop series. I think for this one we had over 700 individuals, RSVP and register for this. We know that some will listen to the recordings, but I think just that even represents the need for us to talk about this. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time taking up too much time because time flies and we don't have a whole lot. Now our speakers are really the folks that we want to hear from. I'll just say a couple of things. We know that the concept of race has no genetic and scientific merit to it at all, but the social construction of it, the race and racism in everyday lives is a very real thing. So while there's no scientific merit, the impact that the social construction of race has in our lives and many BIPOC lives is absolutely real. And so I think for us, we were hoping that we could really start to change our discourse and narrative as about how we talk about things, particularly here in Orange County, California, but also throughout the country. And I think we really need to think about, as we think about health equity, we really need to think about racism like we would an existing health condition. If we do not treat it and do not do something to address it, it will continue to get worse. I think we have seen that unfold more and more recently. And so as we start to see some end to this pandemic, hopefully, and move through this process, there's some light at the end of this tunnel, if you will, but the darkness of race and racism and systemic racism and other isms will definitely continue to persist beyond this moment in time, beyond this pandemic. And so when the dust settles, I think for us, the question is, where are we going to be, not only here in Orange County, but across the nation? And then what can we do to care and to respond and to heal those who are most targeted, minoritized, pushed to the margins where we live and work? And so we need to start putting health before wealth and we need to develop a true health system and not just a sickness management system, which is what we have now. So our hope in this series, and I'm excited about our panelists today and our speakers, and Dr. Della Mosey is going to get us going today. And our hope is that we can talk about the issues and what the issues are, and we think it's important to touch on those. But our hope over the series is to really try to shed some light on how we can begin to move forward. What do we need to do to move forward, and what we need to begin to do to heal, and that's critical. And I love what Dr. Mosley stands for, and radical healing. And her bio, we're going to put her bio in the chat if that hasn't already happened. We're not going to read bios because that'll take more time. But I just want to highlight a couple of things for Dr. Mosley before I turn the stage over to her, if you will. She actually is one of the co-founders of Academics for Black Survival and Wellness, which has been a phenomenal mechanism by which she and her colleagues have really done a lot of education, bringing awareness, healing, this idea of helping people kind of get from this woke stage to the working stage, if you will. And so very powerful stuff. She's also a directs the Wells Healing Research and Consultation Collection, and is also a member of the Psychology of Radical Healing Collective, which is also another, I think, powerful avenue that she's been able to co-create with colleagues as well. And also she recently gave a TEDx talk, and I want to highlight that for you so that you can go check it out, entitled Moving from Woke to Working for Black Futures. And so we're excited to welcome Dr. Della Mosey, who's going to get us started today, and then we will go from there. Dr. Mosey, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, and last thing I want to acknowledge, we had a small typo in Dr. Mosey's spelling of her last name. I think people deserve to have their name spelled correctly, so we will take responsibility for that. So we misspelled her name. We will make that correction moving forward. This is hard work, and so we want to honor the work that you do, and also recognize that for your time and your emotional, physical, and mental, cognitive labor that goes into this. So thank you for being here today. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Gallardo, for the invitation and for that introduction. So glad to be on this panel, this incredible panel, and in conversation with each of you who joined us today. So thanks for being with us. I am going to start with a brief introduction and then jump into making a case for recognizing racism as a public health crisis. I'll discuss the impact of the crisis by offering 3 lenses through which we can better witness racism's impact, and by sharing a brief personal story. And then I'll close by sharing some of my research on how we can solve this crisis, and specifically how BIPOC folks might move towards healing, getting back to that radical healing thing we were just talking about. So I am a healer, scholar, and activist. This combination is important to note because it informs all of my work. My 12 years of counseling experience, primarily serving Black, brown, and queer and trans folks, my past and current work as a scholar focused on preventing and resisting racial trauma, so developing interventions and trying to test how we get towards healing, exploring the ways that racial oppression shows up in people's lives. That experience and my scholarship, as well as my experiences working in various activist roles, have really shaped me and the presentation that you're going to get from me today. On a personal level, as a Black, queer, cisgender woman, I am here for liberation, all of our liberation from all forms of hatred and injustice. I'm unapologetic about my desire to co-create a world where we can all access wellness and be in our dignity. I want that to be a reality for each of us. And so my positionality, my standpoints, my biases, they're there. I'm very biased towards a world where we can all be accepted and included and have access to wellness. And so in these different roles, it has become abundantly clear to me that racism is a public health crisis, period. And in order for us to dismantle it, we need to be able to recognize it as the crisis that it is. We need to be able to name it. We need to be able to look at its sources, consequences, position ourselves in relationship to it, as well as position ourselves in relationship to anti-racism work and the ending of this health crisis. I think it's easier for us to look at some other public health crises and to understand that it is a public health crisis. We look at something like opioid addiction, which takes 91 lives a day. in the United States, or gun violence, which is taking 106 lives a day, or the COVID-19 pandemic, which most recently is taking about 1,300 lives a day. And we can see that. We can see that and be clear that these issues are major public health issues, but we seem to struggle to recognize racism in a similar manner. And so to do that, we have to definitely understand racism, structural or systemic racism. And I like this definition that comes from the Aspen Institute of racism as a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various and often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and to adapt over time. Racism expands and reinforces white supremacy, and structural racism serves as a major barrier to achieving health equity and eliminating racial and ethnic inequities in health outcomes. So we have to understand it. And I've been really grateful for the work of Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Barbara Lee, who introduced a bill to address the public health impacts of structural racism last year. I have some examples that I want to share from their act, which is the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act of 2020, which I really invite you all to check out. Some of the issues that were detailed in this act are listed here, such as the prevalence of chronic health conditions among BIPOC communities, such as heart disease and diabetes, as well as the disproportionate impact of infectious diseases, such as COVID-19. And many of you are likely aware, I think it's gotten perhaps a little bit more press and media attention about the health inequities that Black and American Indian and Alaskan Native mothers and infants face, and that's highlighted there in the middle. And they point out something that I think is not as known to others, which is the little known fact that Black women have the highest rates for 22 of 25 of the severe morbidity indicators used by the CDC. For example, shock, sepsis, cardiac arrest. There's a public health crisis that is impacting BIPOC folks. And if you look at some of these examples, you can think about how it's impacting some of us differently when we use an intersectional lens and think about how sex, gender, race, ability, and the systems of oppression that uphold those are impacting people's lives. And so we have to acknowledge racism as the public health crisis that it is. And we need to do this not just when Black people are murdered on the nightly news and their names become hashtags, which I think is when this conversation really ramps up, right? We need to acknowledge racism as the public health crisis that it is, not just when Latinx folks are experiencing hypersurveillance and being detained and disrespected by ICE. Not just when thousands of Native American and Alaskan Native women are missing and murdered, nor when Asian folks are being violently attacked in the aftermath of presidential race baiting, but we need to recognize that it is a crisis that plays out day by day, chipping away at the wellness, the life chance, and the dignity of BIPOC folks. And since race was created to facilitate slavery and the colonial project, if you're not aware of the sort of history of how race was created, and I really invite you to check out the PBS documentary. Episode 3 is called The House We Live In, and it's really great. It gives a breakdown of the ways that race was structured, and I think that's really important background for folks to have. But for folks, most do know that race was created to, maintain slavery. And so it pitted white folks at the top of the racial hierarchy and Black folks at the bottom. And so because of that, then I want to ensure that you are all also able to recognize the importance of understanding anti-Black racism, which Charlene Carruthers, the author of the book Unapologetic, defines as the system of beliefs and practices that destroy, erode, and dictate the humanity of Black people. So we need to know anti-Black racism, and we need to understand that and think about it, hold it in our mind as we're thinking about racism as a public health crisis. Harvard professor Dr. David Williams notes that there are 200 Black premature deaths a day. So if we're able to recognize the opioid addiction and gun violence as the public health crises that they are, and they take half as many lives a day in the US, then it's imperative that we are also able to recognize racism, and specifically anti-Black racism, in this way. It's a powerful quote from Dr. Bassett, who is really one of the first folks to raise racism as a public health crisis and to really amplify this language. They said there's never been a time, not a single year, where the US population of African descent hasn't been sicker or died younger than white people. I invite you to take note of what you're feeling in this moment. If you're not feeling anything, get curious about that. If you're having some emotional reactions, take note of what they are. If you're having some physical sensations come up as you take in these numbers and think about the data on these last 2 slides, I want you to notice that and decide what it would mean to be accountable to that. To help us to think about the impact, I'm just going to briefly overview these 3 different sort of frameworks that might help us. So the 3 images you see represent frames that we can use to think about the impact of racism. So in this first image, I want you to think about the impact of trauma on the nervous system and on an individual sort of intrapersonal level. You can't get caught up in this. I'm not about to teach this whole model or trauma model, and it's not what's the most important thing here, but it is, I think, important for us to think about the way that when someone is exposed to racism, whether it's a small microaggression or huge occurrence of overt racism, our nervous system is called in and we're reacting to that. And most folks are able to move where we're able to sort of have some wellness. We might ebb and flow between being a little activated, a little aroused when some traumas or stressors come up, but we're able to find some grounding and come back to a baseline. For folks who are constantly being aroused, though, due to racism, we're more often in this fight or flight or freeze mode. And that keeps us from being able to engage socially, from being grounded, from being able to experience health. In these states, we're not well, and we might experience any of the psychological and physical reactions that you see highlighted, such as increased heart rate and anger, or decreased blood pressure and dissociation up at the freeze level. So I want you to hold that in mind, and we're going to move to this next image and think about, so if at an individual, intrapersonal level, I experience racism or a race-based stressor, perhaps from seeing the Confederate flag march through the Capitol or hearing someone white use the N-word, right? Then of course that's going to have an emotional and physical impact, as I just described. I might get in fight or flight mode, I might check out, I might get panicky, I might be on guard. It's going to make me detach from where I'm at. And so though you can look at this 8 dimensions of wellness and think, yeah, when someone experiences racism, they're going to have an emotional reaction. They might have some physical or physiological reactions. But I really like SAMHSA's 8 dimensions of wellness because it helps us to think about the impact at other dimensions as well. So if I'm experiencing racism and it's having this internal impact, then that can ripple. And maybe I'm not connecting socially, or I'm unable to perform at work or school. So that impacts my social, occupational, and intellectual wellness. And as I struggle in those areas, it's likely then that I would have some financial barriers. My ability to earn is impacted. My financial wellness goes down. Or perhaps it influences my spiritual wellness. I lose hope. Right? My hope decreases. So I want you all, when you're thinking about the impact of racism and racism as a public health crisis, not only to think about what might happen and come up naturally, the things that you think about someone experiencing those psychological reactions, but how it has ripples and influences their wellness in other ways. And then looking at this final image, I invite you to consider that wellness, according to Isaac Prilatensky, cannot be obtained if it's not experienced in all 3 levels. So this W is to represent wellness. And Isaac Prilatensky and others say that we can't experience wellness if we are not experiencing it at the personal, relational, and collective level simultaneously. So I might consider myself well. I may be down here in this social engagement stage. I'm not really being aroused by a lot of stressors that have to do with race. And I'm moving through my life and I don't perceive myself to be experiencing other barriers to my wellness related to my race. But as a Black woman, then when I'm out in the world, there's an increased likelihood that I'm going to be exposed to at least the relational level experience of racism, right? But let's say I'm in a work setting where everyone is really, socially conscious. They're working really hard to practice anti-racism, and I don't experience interpersonal forms of anti-Black racism. And I've got a personal level of wellness. But then, if at the collective level, if I'm the only Black person in my department, like I was at my last academic institution, then I'm not going to be able to experience wellness under this model. And I can see that making sense. I can picture that in my life as I think about I can be well, I can have my needs met, I can feel financially, emotionally, socially secure, I can have good colleagues who treat me well. But then if I'm the only Black person, then the burden that's put on me to carry the load, to answer the questions, to be the mentor is disproportionate. And so there's still an impact on me, right? And so when you think about racism as a public health crisis, I want you to just hold in mind these three different frames. How are trauma reactions being involved? How does that influence holistic wellness or create barriers to holistic wellness? And what does that mean across the personal, relational, and collective level? And this isn't just, theoretical for me. Racism has definitely hit me personally. And this picture that I'm using to sort of bring home the impact is, on the left is my dear friend, Heather. And the famous Tay Diggs were at a party, at an all-star weekend party, back in like 2003, I think. And Heather was my best friend and college roommate. And she's from Chicago, went to a predominantly Black high school. We met at a historically Black university where we were roommates. And then she went off to a predominantly and historically white university for her grad school program. And I've used Heather and her truths most recently in the TED Talk that was referenced, Moving from Woke to Working for Black Futures. And it's taken me a long time to be able to share her story, but it feels super important. And I think as we have this conversation about racism as a public health issue, for folks to have someone who's not this sensationalized person, someone who they didn't see get murdered necessarily, but someone who the day-to-day experiences of racism still killed. Heather died by suicide toward the end of her first year of her graduate program because of daily experiences of racism and an inability to access culturally mindful healthcare, mental health care in the face of that. So I invite y'all to check out that talk to learn more about Heather and to get closer to understanding anti-Black racism specifically and racism as a public health issue. But also just this isn't just intellectual or theoretical. I was called to this work to save lives. You understanding the harmful and even deadly impacts of racism is critical to me reaching that goal. So thank you for engaging and staying present as we have this conversation and going beyond this conversation today to take the next best step that you can take to intervene against it. This is a picture of civil rights activist and leader Ella Jo Baker, who is just an incredible ancestor. And she said, in talking about her work, one of the quotes that she's known for, she said, the major job was getting people to understand that they had something within their power that they could use. And it could only be used if they understood what was happening and how group action could counter violence. And it seems that you all understand this very important point, and perhaps that's why you're here today, right? You're here to get a better understanding of what it is that you can do that's within your power, to get a better understanding of how racism is a public health crisis, to get a better understanding of the group actions that can counter this violence. Along those lines, today, I'm really proud of my professional organization, the American Psychological Association, because their Council of Representatives today unanimously passed a historic motion for an APA apology to BIPOC for the role of the American Psychological Association in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy in the US. That is so powerful. And I see this move also as the embodiment of that Ella Jo Baker quote. Collective action is being taken to counter violence. And so what can the rest of us do? What can we do? I have two models I want to briefly introduce and invite you to consider using as you try to answer that question for yourselves. The first comes from an article that was published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and it's based on some research I've done. I center my work on how folks move from woke or aware that racism is real to being able to intervene, to act against it in critical systemic ways. being attuned to power as they intervene against it. And so while I don't expect you to understand these pieces, I want to just talk to you a little bit about what I learned from this work, about how we can work to solve the problem of racism. I learned from the activists who I spoke with, folks who told me their narratives of how they moved from understanding racism to being able to do something about it. They first started by being able to critically look at, witness, name, notice the way that racism is showing up inside them and around them. That's like a super important step. And it's harder than you think. No matter what your race is, it can be harder than you think. We internalize racism, we perpetuate it against one another. It's normalized in our society. And so we don't even see the way that it's operating. And so for people of color, we need to not only be able to witness anti-Black racism, but also be able to notice and name the way that racial trauma might be occurring for us. And for white folks and non-Black people of color, it's just important that we're able to bear witness to racism and specifically anti-Black racism. And then the important work of being able to do something about it is in this processing stage. What I learned was that people have to be able to make sense of the racism that they're witnessing. And that means to make sense of it, you have to learn about your own identities and your own relationship to racism and to anti-racism. You have to be able to study power and intersectionality. You have to grow cognitively by learning the history of racism and how to practice equity. You have to learn the strategies that'll help you intervene against racism as it happens. That's the behavioral growth. So maybe you need to learn what are the words that you can say that can provide some validation in the face of harm that's been caused? What can you say or do to prevent the policies being written in your spaces that are perpetuating racism of different forms? So gaining those very practical skills. And then when you do that, you're able to increase your efficacy, you increase your sense that whether alone or together, you can do something to interrupt racism. And then you have to actually do the work of interrupting racism. And so that's what this model shows and describes. And what's important to think about here on this last stage, there's no steps here for me to tell you, because to do the work, to solve the problem, to intervene against racism and to reduce this crisis that we're in, my research shows that it needs to be you have to take a very personal approach. The approach that you take to intervening and practicing anti-racism needs to be based on who you are, where you're located, what your skills are, your talents are, what your privileges are, because it needs to be sustainable. What these activists told me was that they found ways to chip away at racism, to prevent it or to resist it based on where they were located locally, based on what they enjoyed doing, based on what they could see and iterate on and work on over the years to make better, right, and grow from. And so if you want to learn more about how to develop your own personalized sort of plan for interrupting racism, and if you're willing to sort of invest some meaningful time in that, I invite you to please check out, go to my website, delavmosley.com. There's a free workbook that is very personalized, and it'll take you step by step through this to locate yourself and identifying what are the pathways towards intervening that could be helpful for you. And then for BIPOC folks, I just want to briefly encourage you to check out Radical Healing. We have a blog that I think is pretty accessible on Psychology Today that describes some very practical tips for how we can get towards healing in the face of racism, right? And basically the big picture, what this model says is that in order for BIPOC folks to experience wellness, to experience radical healing, we need to simultaneously be aware of the interlocking systems of oppression and hate that are impacting our wellness, and be able to envision justice and liberation. When we stay too much on the side of just breaking down and being critically aware of oppression and hate, then we can be more depressed and not as well. And if we stay in the side of just envisioning justice and liberation and, moving towards joy and wellness, then we're not going to be our interventions are not going to be as tight. We're not going to be able to dismantle. We're not going to be moving towards prevention, because we're not being real about the systems of oppression and hate that are working against us and constantly changing as they are working against us. And so this model has 5 anchors: critical consciousness, cultural authenticity and self-knowledge, radical hope, emotional and social support, and strength and resistance. And so these are the different pathways that can help us to live in that middle space with that deep awareness and with a greater sense of healing and wellness. And I think it's really important for us to think about healing rather than coping. Coping is very reactive, and it's like, I need to get through the day to day, and coping is important. If you're dealing with racism, you need to be able to cope with it to continue to get back to that baseline that we were just talking about when you're having those different trauma reactions. but we need to also heal. We need to prevent. We need to resist. I don't want us to just be reactionary. To solve this problem, to fix racism as a public health crisis, we need to center healing and collective action. And so that's what this model is encouraging you to do. And I encourage folks, if they haven't, to try to find the healers, the comrades, the people who you can be in conversation with that allow you to be your fully authentic self as a BIPOC person, that help you to tap into whatever gives you hope as you navigate this society right now, to build up your number and diversity of emotional and social support tools and strategies, right? And that could and should look very different for us based on how we are positioned, based on who we are. And so as I close out today, I invite you to pause for a minute and just think about, what is your relationship to racism? Are you perpetuating racism? Are you aware of how internalized racism might be showing up in you? Are you a part of a system that is not doing really good when it comes to dismantling structural racism? Where are you? And then on the other side of that, what is your relationship to anti-racism? Your personal relationship, what have you done? How did it feel? Did it work? Are you still doing it? What moved you away from it? What moves you towards it? What's the impact of it? What is your relationship to anti-racism work? And after you really think about those two questions, I want you to ask yourself if you're okay with the answers, given what you know about their impact on racism as a public health crisis. The images you see here are just some examples that show some of the work that I've done, and I show them just to highlight the sort of the specificity, right? Like this group, I'm supervising one of my graduate students who leads a support group for Black graduate students. So that's something that's in my wheelhouse. It doesn't take a lot more out of me. It's something that I consider a strength already. And so choosing the things that are right for you. And Academics for Black Survival and Wellness, which was mentioned, if you aren't familiar with, or you want to deepen your ability to be aware of racism and how it is a crisis, I invite you to go to the Academics for Black Lives website and check out some of the free resources there. Deepen your awareness. That'll help you in that first stage of critical consciousness development. Or do whatever is necessary for you after you answer that question about where are you and are you okay with it? I hope this has been helpful in some ways. It's been a joy to spend a little bit of time with you this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation. Please feel free to reach out to me in whatever way feels right for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mosley. We asked you to do the impossible task of addressing why racism is a public health crisis in 20 minutes. So I think mission accomplished. So well done. Thank you for the thoughts and the comments and the reflections. So really appreciate it. We put some stuff in the chat. A couple of folks said to us they really appreciate you sharing the personal story as well, and so I've had some comments there. But people can't put stuff in the chat; they're just coming to us. So we're gonna put stuff out there as we can. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. We're gonna have a panel after our speakers are done today. So hang tight. We'll ask some questions at that point and engage. I'm gonna turn it over to Ileana at this point. Thank you.
I just love that presentation. Miguel, thank you for answering the questions, because I was paying attention to Dr. Mosley and just enjoying every moment of that. It is my pleasure to introduce Kieran Savage Sangwan, who is the Executive Director of the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network. We've had the privilege of working with CPAN for over 5-6 years, and consider ourselves sort of a mini CPAN in Orange County. Kieran is an amazing leader at CPAN, and CPAN is a statewide multicultural health advocacy organization focused on eliminating persistent health inequities and addressing structural racism in healthcare. Prior to becoming the executive director in 2019, Kieran served as CPAN's deputy director and health integration policy director. In those roles, she was the chief architect of many CPAN bills, in particular, the groundbreaking bill to prohibit hospital patient dumping that became California law in 2018. Kieran has been instrumental in positioning CPAN as a leader in the health equity field, expanding CPAN's work in public, mental, and oral health, deepening CPAN's local advocacy impact, and developing new partnerships and campaigns. So thank you so much, Kieran, for being with us today.
Ileana, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see what I can do here. All right, hopefully you all can see that. I think you can see that. So thank you so much, Ileana, Miguel, and everyone at OC Mecca, as well as all of the attendees today. You know, like Ileana said, we really, you know, appreciate and value our partnership with OC Mecca. So just really thrilled to be here today and very honored to follow Dr. Mosley. I'm definitely sitting with those questions that you offered at the end. So appreciate you really calling on us to sort of dig into ourselves and examine both our individual and collective roles here. So want to really appreciate you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of how we move forward once we understand that racism is a public health crisis on the collective piece of that Dr. Mosley talked about. And so, but before I do that, I just want to tell you a little bit more about who we are. Let's see if I can advance my slides. Okay. So we're the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, otherwise known as CPEN, and we were founded in 1992, so nearly 30 years ago, actually in the wake of the racially motivated police beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles that many folks probably remember, and the subsequent acquittal of the responsible officers. And that moment really called on several organizations in the state of California who each represented and were deeply embedded and a part of diverse racial and ethnic communities to come together to think both about how we stand in solidarity with one another and particularly against anti-Black racism, as Dr. Mosley described, and also how we look at the drivers of poor health in our community, which include violence in all of its forms. And so our founding partners, I always like to pay tribute to them, the California Black Health Network, the California Rural Indian Health Board, the Latino Coalition for a Healthy California, and the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum came together and said, you know, we need to have a way in which we stand together, in which we have a collective voice in advancing health equity. And today we still very much embrace that multicultural network and organizing model in order to build people power and achieve healthy communities for all Californians. And fundamentally, we believe that health equity is about community power and that it's about shifting the balance of power so that communities have the ability to determine their own destinies.
Karen, quick question. Some of your slides are a little cut off, actually. So I don't know if we can, we got a couple of comments if we could. They're cutting off a little bit, so I'm not sure. Yeah. And if it's going to take too long or be too much of an issue, it's okay. I just want to let you know in case you weren't sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, that's fine. That's
Sorry,
fine.
I'm not the
okay,
techie person. Happy to share the slides after though.
Okay, thank you. Cool.
Yeah. So sorry, that's not going to be helpful for this slide in particular, where there's a graphic. But I'll say, you know, we really like to look at this framework for health equity that comes from the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, or BARHI, which is the collaborative of public health departments in the Bay Area. And they put together this framework to really take us from looking at health disparities to really what are the upstream factors that result in, or what are the causes or the drivers of those health disparities. So on the right-hand side of this diagram, you see what is referred to as downstream, which is really where we focus most of current public health practice. And it's very important, right? It's critical. This is where we look at things like life expectancy. This is where we look at chronic and communicable disease. This is where we look at risk factors and how we can address those individual behaviors and risk factors that lead to poor health outcomes. And this is really where we focus a lot of our time when we think about disparities and racially based disparities in health and health outcomes, right? Looking at asthma rates, looking at diabetes rates, maternal and infant health outcomes. And a lot of the interventions that we have for those, or ways that we look at changing those, are very focused on the individual and the types of services we can the types of healthcare services we can wrap around that individual. So an absolutely critical piece. However, what we also know is that in order to really make significant change in those health disparities, we need to move upstream from that, right? And really look at what are the factors that are causing those inequities. And so as you move to the left on this diagram, then you see what this framework calls living conditions, right? And so this is your housing. Do we have access to safe and affordable housing? Even do you have access to healthcare, employment, income, et cetera? Some folks might be familiar with thinking about these things as the social determinants of health, right? Or the drivers of health. But this is basically the acknowledgement that where you live, work, and play has a significant impact on your ability to achieve good health, right? And that we have to address these factors. And one of the things that's really core among these factors that doesn't get talked about as much is exposure to racism and discrimination, right? And Dr. Mosley talked a lot about sort of the biological, physiological factors that result in exposure to racism causing poor health outcomes. But there's a large body of literature that really says that exposure to racism itself is a key driver of health inequities. And so we need to address it through many of the strategies that Dr. Mosley mentioned. And where we're really focused when we think about racism as a public health crisis is even going upstream or to the drivers of these living conditions or social determinants of health. And that's where we look at how institutional inequities and social inequities are linked. And so that's why you see, if you can see it, the double arrow that goes both ways between social inequities and institutional inequities. So what does that mean? That means looking at how class, race, immigration status, gender, sexual orientation, how discrimination and even implicit bias based on those, but really specifically focused on race and even more specifically often focused on anti-Black racism, impacts how we make laws and policies and government structures that then result in the policy decisions that create the living conditions that result in health disparities, right? So thinking about it with this framework gives us a number of avenues that we can use to really make meaningful change on reducing and eliminating health disparities. So maybe just slightly simplified way of looking at it is that social and institutional inequity leads to the drivers of poor health, which then lead to health disparities. And again, that we need to be having interventions and changes and transformations all across this spectrum in order to really drive the change that we want to see. So there's a scholar, his name is Dr. Daniel Dawes. He's the director of an institute at Morehouse School of Medicine that really looks at health inequities. And he has written a book that is really interesting. It's called The Political Determinants of Health. And when he talks about the political determinants of health, this is not so much about, red, blue, and purple, right? But this is really about how government makes decisions and the impacts that they have on communities. And so what he says, which I think is very true when we think about how do we really operationalize racism as a public health crisis, is that the social drivers of poor health and health inequities, which are those things like housing, education, and income, are created by policy and political decisions, right? They didn't just happen. They were very intentionally created because of structural and institutional racism. And that often we don't address that. And that, this is a quote from him from his book that I think is important. Health equities owing to political action or inaction have become so structurally entrenched that it has been difficult to identify their root causes, right? So we're never really getting to those root causes because it's so much a part of our society at this point, but that is where we have to dig in if we want to see transformation around anti-racism, right? And that in order to advance health equity, we really need to connect those dots that are around government, policy, laws and regulations, how people interact with government, et cetera. Another sort of publication that's out there that I think is really important, it's called the Health and Democracy Index, and it was developed by the Network for Public Health Law. And they went through a number of health metrics, right? So they looked at things like self-reported health and mental health status. They looked at the prevalence of chronic health conditions. They looked at health risk behaviors, things like smoking, right? They looked at life expectancy. And they saw that it was directly correlated with rates of civic engagement. So the theory basically being really, again, really upstream in those institutional inequities, that we can impact those through increased civic engagement of our communities. And that, this sort of feels very obvious when I say it, but I think it's really overlooked, which is that increased civic engagement in our communities leads to better health policy and more equitable health policy, which in turn leads to better and more equitable health outcomes. Now, when I say civic engagement, people have a tendency to think, okay, voting, right? Or elected officials. But civic engagement is a huge body of things we think about how our communities are able to come together to achieve collective impact, right? So everything from volunteering to your involvement in advocacy with OC Mecca, all of those things are part of civic engagement. But there are so many barriers to civic engagement, right, for communities of color because of those institutional and societal inequities that we have very uneven ability to be civically engaged, right? And so what we need to do is think about how do we address those barriers and how do we provide an opportunity for communities of color to really engage and shape the direction of laws, policies, government systems. And so that's where we get to sort of this idea of racism. How do we really impact racism as a public health crisis? And so in July of 2020, CPEN, with several of our partners, and particularly our partners who are Black-led organizations, got together and said, we want the state of California to take a strong stand to say, yes, racism is a public health crisis, and here's what we can do about it. So we wrote in a letter that was co-signed by hundreds of organizations to Governor Newsom. We urged the state to declare racism to be a statewide public health crisis, which would serve as an important first step in the state's acknowledgement of its own racist history through the present day, and would establish specific commitments and measurable actions to begin to undo the racism that prevents all Californians, but especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, from achieving optimal health and well-being. So we called on the state to take this action. I will say at this point in time, the state has not taken this action, and so the campaign very much continues, and we invite you all to join us in that effort. But what is this really like? What are we really asking for here, right? So some of the specific things that we suggest, right, to the state and also the local governments to think about in order to undo structural racism and build an intentionally and explicitly anti-racist society are to acknowledge the effects of intergenerational racism on population health, and especially the impact of anti-Black racism. So that acknowledgement piece, that's a critical first step. To assess the internal policies and procedures of government itself with a racial equity lens, to advocate for laws and regulations that center and promote racial equity, to ensure inclusivity and diversity in leadership, workforce, hiring, and contracting, to promote educational efforts to address and dismantle racism, to identify clear goals and objectives with specific benchmarks to assess progress and to hold ourselves accountable, and to dedicate resources to anti-racism activities. And so these are elements that are contained in some declarations of racism as a public health crisis that have been made across the country that are particularly important. And across the country, as of, I think this was, they were counted in August, but there were over 200 declarations that had been made in 37 states, the greatest number of those being in California. And those include declarations that were made at the city, county, and state levels. So it includes things like school boards, health departments, et cetera. And the American Public Health Association went through all of these 200 declarations and looked at what was the substance of them, and identified 10 domains of potential action, which are listed on here, and I won't read them. But I think it's important to note that they identified that 32 of the declarations included no actions. They were just a statement, a declaration, a resolution, and they committed to no action. And I think that's really important to note because we need to make sure that our path towards equity is real here and that we're making tangible commitments. And then we're not sort of just saying the right thing for the sake of saying it, right? But that we're really putting our power behind these declarations. And so as we move forward, as CPEN moves forward with our advocacy to the state, and as all of you move forward with thinking about how can we really advance solutions to the fact that racism is a public health crisis, a couple of next steps that we think about. One, again, is to avoid performative declarations or resolutions. That can sometimes take us backwards, right? To think that we're doing something but not take action, right? So to not do something that's only a declaration or resolution. But instead to really form authentic government and community partnerships where we really share power to determine what are the specific action steps that are important in our communities. That we also need to increase access to racially equitable civic engagement opportunities, right, as I described earlier. And that we can't forget that really funding and resources are a backbone of all of these efforts, and that we need our governments, our state and local governments, to really analyze how where we put our dollars drives change, right? And to redirect funding to support anti-racism efforts. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back over, I think, to Ileana.
Thank you, Kieran. I so appreciate CPAN being at the forefront of this movement and throughout the pandemic. So thank you for sharing all of these things. We will be sending everyone the PowerPoint. It was cut off a little bit. So, and it also will be posted on YouTube, and it will also be on our Facebook Live for people to see and share as well. So right now we're going to start our panel discussion. So I'd like to invite everyone to just kind of bring their camera on, and we'll get started. We have two additional individuals joining us today. And Miguel and I will be moderating. I'll put our bios in the chat. But the two speakers that we have today are Dr. Clayton Chow, who is the director of the Healthcare Agency and Public Health Officer. I feel like you don't need an introduction, Dr. Clayton Chow. But you've been at the center of this pandemic, and you've just done so much on with so many different organizations. I'm going to put your bio in the chat, and but you've definitely been a key leader. And I want to just mention that Dr. Chow was Physician of the Year this past year, and just an amazing individual to share his thoughts today. And we have Jennifer Wang, who's the Chief Operating Officer at ASCSC. And she's also a commissioner for the Orange County Human Relations Commission. And she's been a key leader in the Asian community here in Orange County. So I will also share your bios in the chat. But without further ado, Miguel, if you could help me get started with the panel discussion. We just wanted to talk about, just reflect and first on everything that we listened to, and just reflect so far on our experiences since this pandemic started.
Yeah, sure. And I'm wondering actually, if Dr. Chow wants to chime in, actually, as the county's sort of public health officer and director of our healthcare agency. You've really, as Ileana mentioned, really been in the center of this process moving forward. Quite frankly, this work has taken I think a toll in many different ways. I mean, even doing these workshops, part of the reason that we are sort of have webinar style and aren't letting comments come through on us, because there's some reactions and responses ahead of time about even talking about this, about even naming racism as a public health crisis. And so, going so far as to making threats and whatnot. And so, this is a real issue. And so, Dr. Chow, I know you are no stranger to some of these processes as you've negotiated and navigated, throughout this pandemic, and even before that. I mean, you've been doing this work for a long time, but I mean, do you want to share with us just sort of maybe what you heard today, your experiences, kind of what you hope to see moving forward in public health and behavioral health? I mean, we're going to focus on, it's always that balance of how do we acknowledge the legacies, the historical processes, but also focus on kind of moving forward. And so wonder if you want to share any of the work that's happening, your vision, kind of what you'd like to see happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gallardo and Ileana, for inviting me to share my thought. And I'll tell you, I can listen to Karen and Dr. Mosley for hours. Before we got on, Dr. Mosley, I remember I said, I don't know why I've seen you. I know I've seen you before. Well, I have watched your TED Talks over and over and multiple times. And every time I watched it, it gave me a different emotion. And crying is part of that too. So I just want to let you know, for those of you in the audience who have not watched it, you have to watch it. It is really powerful. So thank you for joining this conversation today. It's really good. And Kieran, your work speaks for itself. Statewide, you've been the champion for all of us on the health and the social services side. So thank you so much. Those of you who have talked to me or have seen me in several discussions, I think this pandemic, unfortunately that we lost a lot of life, but fortunately it pushed the issue of health and human inequity truly to the forefront. Issue that we have dealt with for decades. Sometimes conversation just happen and just stop dead, no action. I think Karen, you talk about that. And that we struggle to find the right opportunity to really bring it to the national and honestly global forefront, right? Not only we talk about death in the Black and the Latinx community here in the US, but we're talking about death in the country where there's a lot of poor people, and unfortunately in Africa, in South America, and also in Asia. Not only the pandemic, the viruses have caused that kind of havoc, but when you talk about the distribution of the vaccine, think about where we are compared to the rest of the world, especially the underdeveloped worlds. There are countries in Africa where the vaccine rate is single digit because people have no access to the vaccine, right? There are countries like India, people are struggling, and Vietnam, people are struggling to bring the vaccine in and so that they can save life. Country in South America that's struggling with access to the vaccine, right? So yes, we need to talk about this from a global perspective. And in my view, I think the pandemic at least awakened a piece of humanity in most of us, especially those from the BIPOC community. And what action must we take in order to stop this and in order to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic? And we really, if we don't do it, then we have not learned anything throughout this 20 months. So that's very crucial. And so from a personal perspective, you all know, you probably have heard that I've gotten protests in front of my house several times. People show up to the board supervisor protesting and demanded that I be fired. And I think it's very racially encouraged. Because if they target me as a person, as a health officer, then they would have dig up information about me, right? But rather they would go to my house and have a sign in front of my house and tell me to go back to China. Well, obviously you don't know who I am, and you only look at the way my appearance and assume that I came from China and tell me to go back to China. Likewise, they would come to the board and tell me to go back to China. I wasn't born in China. I didn't come from China for that matter. And so that speaks to the racism piece of it. And also, if you notice, those public health officials that have been targeted tend to be women, tend to be officer of color, right? So my colleague up and down the state who are people of color are more targeted than non-colored health officer. We had a conversation about this. And in fact, I think 60 Minutes of 2020 interview a group of public health officials who are women and talk about how they have been targeted specifically because of who they are in terms of their gender. So and forgive me, I think that we have to speak about racism and sexism in the same context, because for a woman of color like Dr. Mosley, like Kieran, like Ileana, like Jennifer, you experience much more discrimination than I do, even as a person of color. But I'm a man, right? And so we need to move that conversation to the forefront, because we know that this racism, this sexism, this discrimination has really been perpetuated in a way that women, intellectual women like all of you, are being viewed by the public. So we have to talk about the 3 S's of racism, of this crisis that we call. That's how my mind construct, right? Is I find synonyms. So the 3 S's related to the topic today for me has to do with a social element, has to do with a structural element, and also has to do with a system element, right? And so I very briefly, we got to talk about who we are as professional being discriminated in our work, right? I remember numerous times patient would tell me, well, I don't trust you because, lack of a better word, you are a chink doctor, right? And because of my race, I am a lesser than physician. And this came from even people within our own non-white community as well. So that's the piece that we have not talked about, because it is not just about white and non-white, but even among people of color, there is that racism that we have to talk about, because it's real. It is really real. And in order for us to move that to the next step, we internally, our own non-white people, have to address that head on. And we need to come together, and we need to find a way to be inclusive. So the solution for this, in other words, is inclusivity. It doesn't matter who you are or you white. And then we also have white colleagues who also faces racism in that sense as well. So this is a social issue. So we need to address that. The structural issue has very much to do with the politics of this. You all know, when we all talk about this pandemic is a communicable disease that has been politicized so much in our country, particularly. So it's no longer, to me, it's not a medical pandemic, but unfortunately, it's the political pandemic, if that's such a thing, if you know what I mean. And then opportunity, right? We all talk about opportunity for education, for employment. Those are the structural pieces that we have to talk about, right? And then lastly, from a health and human health system perspective, is all interconnected to the other pieces, the structural and the social, that we got to change system. We cannot just talk it in the periphery, but don't have solution from a system perspective, right? Because it's all tied into it, right? And you all know, specifically in California, last year, because of the lockdown, we all expected that the state would have less tax dollars because people were not able to work. But in fact, the one who was out of work were the poor. If you look at those who was rich, they actually made more money last year than the poor. And so there's that scale. If a lot of people make a lot of money, it means that a whole lot more people did not make any money, and poverty for them. The separation between the poor and the rich get really wider, right? And so those are the systemic structural and social issue that we must talk about. I don't know if I answer your question, but I think that I, as a health officer, what I experienced this last 20 months, a lot of it is about racism. Now, I'm not saying that people were not, those who protest or against this and that have their own reason and their own perception and why they got so emotionally charged about this, right? Just like the patient who tell me that, or who literally tell me that I don't want to see you because of your race and I think you're worse than, there's something about me that trigger them. For those of us who are in the mental health field, we know trigger is a very powerful tool to get people emotionally charged. And so we in order for us to move forward, we have to acknowledge all of those feelings, all of the underlying prejudice or discrimination among ourselves, among us all as a human race. And then finally, inclusion is the way to move this forward. So I'll stop for now.
Sorry, Dr. I got kicked out, so Ileana's going to have to jump on that.
I was just listening intently, and to every speaker, I'm just loud.
I had a technological glitch. My apologies.
That's why there's two of us, Miguel. So thank you, Dr. Chow, for sharing your thoughts. They were really profound. And I'd love to do a follow-up question for you. And what is your vision moving forward? What do you think we should be doing in terms of addressing health equity? What are just some key things, initiatives, vision that you're doing currently?
Thank you. So as probably well known by now for folks in Orange County, is fortunate to got a grant from the CDC to address the issue of health inequity as is related to COVID, and we are planning that grant. And in that grant, my charge to my staff is we don't need to create more programs, because if we create program with temporary funding that we have to cut off at the end of the 2 year, we are doing a disservice for the community. What we ought to use that funding to create systemic change that are sustainable for the community. It is an opportunity for us to make that changes. And that changes include going to the community that are affected, the vulnerable community, the Black community, the Latinx community, the Asian community, the community of LGBT, the community of people who are disabled, and work with the community to build infrastructure that would bring equity to health and social services for a long time to come, right? So it will be very easy for us to say, well, take that money and create program and chop it up and do this for 2 years. But at the end, those programs will not be sustainable and that we have not accomplished anything. But rather what we need to do is use that funding to create infrastructure support for community-based organizations that historically do not have an infrastructure to go after funding or to provide services in the long term. So those of you who are a community-based organization leader, you know what I'm talking about, right? It is very difficult to compete for funding when you have a very lean infrastructure. So you have to decide, how do I advocate for more funding and then run the programs, because most of the funding you got is to run program, and then to speak up for the community, to educate the community, and to engage the community to be inclusive. Those are a lot of work that programming funding do not allow you to do so. So this funding that coming to us, we have an opportunity to support all of us to build that piece of infrastructure to move forward beyond the 2 years time limit in this funding. And that's the goal. And I know it has created a lot of controversials and a lot of hurt feeling. But we would only do well if all of us do well. That's what I'm going to say, right? If only a few of us do well and the rest of us, and this by this I mean our community, struggle, in the end, we can move forward, because we can't think of inclusivity when you're vying for, that little part of funding. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's our goal, is to ensure that we have funding to be infrastructure. And this is time for us to do this, because we have the excitement and the verbal commitment from other health systems in Orange County who want to come in and do this with us, right? Let us put our resources together to move this. So that, however, that $20 million from CDC grant now have the potential to be bigger than that, for us to really create systemic change in the community for the community. Yes, Dr. Mosley, nobody's free until everybody's free. Absolutely. Nobody win until everybody win, right? So the solution is a win-win solution. It should not be a win-lose solution, just like last year. There are people who richer made more money and people who poor became much poorer. That is not the system we want to build. So.
Health before wealth. Health before wealth. Yeah. There was a question that came up in the chat, in the Q&A. I got kicked out and I can't access them again, but there was another one that came up, and I'm just curious if folks want to respond. So, it's like, how do you build trust, and collaborate? Because I mean, a lot of it's around collaboration and working together and moving forward. But there's a lot of good reasons why there's hesitancy and some what I would call very healthy and functional and adaptive resistance to sort of working alongside other, whether it's a main entity like the county healthcare agency or some other entity in general. And so one of the questions was, how do we work alongside and in collaboration with, folks to address these issues? What specific actions can panelists suggest in help overcoming past hesitancies and mistrust that have kept us also working in isolation and silos at the same time?
Can I? I'm on the road now. Let me answer that one. Yeah. So one of my beloved mentor, a Black doctor, female Black doctor, Dr. Gertrude Carter's, who taught me this, and it stick with me now forever. And that is, all of this nonsense, that's her words, are noises. Okay. We have to get past the noises, and we need to know laser focus is, what is our mission? Who is our ultimate target population, the target audience, or the target achievement? And if we all agree that ultimately our goal is to eliminate disparity, inequality for the vulnerable population, then we should not have any problem to come together to the same table, to have the same mission, the same vision, whether or not you're Black or white or Asian or Latinx. That's it. That's it. So sorry, ladies. I'm being rude. So
you're not being rude, but I would like to chime in, and I want to agree with, first of all, thank you, the panelists. I'm actually very humbled to be here. But I do want to chime in the fact that there is a lot of distraction. There is a lot of noise. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of stories, drama being, stirred up. And one saving grace is the fact that I'm a relational person. I lead a CBO. I develop relationships not only with my colleagues, right, who also lead, but people who are on the ground. And I want to share the fact that, I am forever grateful to Dr. Chow for listening. Like, that has been really key in our development, the key to really moving us forward during this pandemic, because I'll tell you, I remember when Dr. Chow came in, it was May the 4th. May the 4th is important for us because of Star Wars, and we actually had a screening for our seniors, a couple of years ago. So that's always ingrained in me, because we wanted to tell the seniors the power was within you, right? You know, like there is deprivation when you come here as an immigrant, as a refugee, but you survived and we're here for you. And we can bring all the tools and all the resources to you. But you also need to reflect. And when this year, January 4th, when we had our support group for our seniors, and we had seniors from all over the county come, it was our Santa Ana seniors, who I believe is really a core, really resilient group. Something was off about them. Their tone, our staff was like, you know, so there's something off about their facial expression, right? That we did our homework and we found out, you know, now we know the next day, Tuesday, that I believe, Dr. Chow, correct me if I'm wrong, that's like the highest number of deaths because of COVID. Wednesday, I had providers, doctors, nurse practitioners, PAs calling me, crying. I don't know what to do anymore. The holidays hit. They're not even making it to the hospitals. That evening, I still remember I was sitting in my garage and I wrote a letter to Dr. Chow telling him what's happening. I don't know what the solution is. I just know that this is an issue and it's out of my hand. And then I know on Thursday, Dr. Chow went to our task force, our COVID-19 vaccine task force, and asked them, can we vaccinate 75 years and older? They approved it. Friday, I get a call pretty late in the afternoon. Hey, we want you to host a COVID clinic for the seniors. I still remember I had Dr. Chow actually on speaker. I've never spoken to him before. And I looked at my staff looked at me and they're like, no. And then I said, yes. And on Sunday, January 10th, we vaccinated 220 people. And right now we've actually hosted over 161 clinics. We have vaccinated our seniors, our most vulnerable. And to this day, I will remember those phone calls that I got, the messages, the emails of people who were just so angry at me because they said, you need to stay in your lane. Vaccination has nothing to do with you. You should not be vaccinating the Latinx seniors. You should stay in your lane. You are Asian. You are only supposed to be focusing on your mission. The thing is, people don't understand because in the spectrum of CBOs, people don't really know us, right? The communities that we serve know us. And guess what? I remember Dr. Chow and his team asking, hey, what language capacity you guys have? And I said, what do you mean? In the buildings, these buildings that we want to save, it's our Latinx, it's our Filipinos, it's our Chinese, it's our Vietnamese, it's our Korean, it's, you know, down the line. We're going to have all those languages. We're going to have all those spaces so they will feel comfortable. This is a safe space. We need to create a safe space for them. You know, so when you guys talk about racism, and I'm also thinking about ethnocentrism, you know, and that's very real for me. It's still very real for me, you know, and the way I perceive things, this virus didn't discriminate. I don't discriminate in terms of, yeah, we have internalized racism, like, you know, but the thing is, I'm surrounded by colleagues who we keep each other accountable, right? And I call them out and they call me out. And we are in a space like Dr. Mosley, you actually asked us, are we in a system in which we're continuing oppression? I will say yes. Mm-hmm. The way we're set up right now, the ones who have a bigger influence, whether it's with, you know, with funders or with elected officials or with whomever it may be, the powers that may be, they have that leverage. And one thing that I have to, you know, I emphasize in many spaces that if you know me, you know I'm not quiet. I advocate for our communities. I advocate for our BIPOC. I advocate for those I know who do not have a voice. And I will just say that I'm not quiet. You're just not listening. Okay. And so I'll leave it at that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just want to say I've witnessed Jennifer work at the Mexican consulate, at Northgate Market, with different ethnic communities. And you've been amazing during this pandemic, doing vaccination clinics everywhere with multiple communities, just making sure that that we're reaching the people that are hard to reach, that don't have access to the vaccine. So thank you for your efforts. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question in terms of, you know, another pandemic is this anti-Asian hate. Can you speak to your experience on that and your involvement with the Asian community and helping to address that issue?
Absolutely. I mean, anti-Asian hate, the way I view it, in Orange County, what I'm actually really hopeful of is that there's many people who actually associate anti-Asian hate with the bigger picture of BIPOC community. We had a resolution actually that was passed a couple months ago, and that was really because of the Atlanta shooting. That same day with the Atlanta shooting, I was actually outside at the taco truck getting food with our team, and I'm standing there and I see a white gentleman. He just starts throwing things at these Latino gentlemen at the taco truck. And there's families there, there's elderly there, and it's quite obvious what his intention was. And I looked around and I said, oh my God, what do I do here? Because my background, I'm comfortable calling the authorities, right? But that's unique to me. Like I feel like Santa Ana Dispatch, they know my voice because I will report it. I have no problem doing so, right? So for what we're doing with, anti-Asian hate, what is really critical is to be able to tie that back to the other groups, make that connection, and understand that when one group hurts, everybody else is hurting. And for what we're doing, what's come out of it, actually, I have to say that I see a lot of people, these intellectual people who think that they're safe in the ivory towers, you know what? They're taking personal time off because they are taking their kids and they're going to these parks with their young, beautiful Asian baby. And these little white kids are coming up to them and, hey, you're COVID. Hey, you're the virus. And these are in cities that are very well-to-do. And they come to me and they're like, what do I do? And I said, that's a great question. What do you think you should do? So there's just a lot of reflection when it comes to racism. There's a lot of reflection when it comes to this movement in terms of how does it apply to you, but how does it apply to your neighbor? What are you going to do about it? Have these conversations. To talk about race doesn't make you racist, right? I think a lot of people are uncomfortable because they're like, oh, well, I'm colorblind. If you're colorblind and you look at me, you look at my face, you look at Dr. Chow mentioned it. He's an Asian man. When you look at me, I'm an Asian woman, right? If you deny me my color, then you're denying me. You don't see me. If you don't see me, you don't know why I make my decisions, where I'm coming from. If, like some people, because of my upbringing, really, like I said, I'm comfortable with authority, right? But I'm very much aware of I need to also be careful about the authority. Who, when I call it, where I call it, when I'm bringing them in, right? I need to protect those around me who are vulnerable. I very much recognize the fact that we have to humanize, these people. We have to humanize the numbers. Dr. Mosley, thank you so much for sharing the story about Heather. I love my college roommate too. She's a Latina American who married an African American, and when BLM happened last year, she and I were talking on the phone. How do I translate for my solution? My solution was to have these difficult conversations with our elders. What does it mean to you? Why is it applicable to you? You're in those buildings. We're trying to save you. Why are they walking around your building? Why are they protesting? I will put into that context. We will have these difficult conversations, right? Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this difficult conversation with these really conservative ladies, and we were talking about actual mental health. We were talking about kids. We were talking about, what can we do to prevent them from killing themselves? Quite simply, right? They're like, what do we do? Guess what? LGBTQ came up, that topic. And another hopeful moment was the fact that these parents said, wow, this is a subject I would have never talked about. This is so difficult. I don't know what to do. And for us, we're like, that in itself, right? Continue these conversations. Of course, have it with somebody who is knowledgeable, who can provide, the information, the accurate information, right? The most up to date, but have the conversations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, I have to leave. If I could just give a final thought, that I also have white friends and colleagues who are very distraught of what's happening, and they felt helpless and not knowing what they can contribute to the solution. And I tell them that we need to all come together. we really need to all come together to the same table and address this together. Inclusivity. That's the goal, right? Because we can't do it alone. No, it shouldn't be a win-lose situation. It should be a win-win situation for everyone. So with that, Dr. Mosley, thank you. Karen, thank you. Jennifer, thank you. This is fantastic. I look forward to the next few webinar, but I apologize. I have to sign up for a meeting. Everybody, thank you for joining us. I'm a health officer, so I have to say this, right? So Halloween, just celebrate safely, please. The virus is still out there, so know your risk and celebrate appropriately. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton Chow. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and with that, I'd like to welcome everyone else and having some closing remarks. Any thoughts? This is a big challenge for us, but we have to begin somewhere to begin to be anti-racist and begin to dismantle the oppression of that we have. So any closing thoughts that you have, and I will also we have a poll going on, and then I also will be putting a survey in the chat for folks to let us know what you thought of today's session. So I'll start with Dr. Mosley.
Thank you. Thank y'all again for being here, and for all the folks who stuck it out on Facebook and in this webinar. Thanks for staying. This was a powerful conversation. Jennifer, Karen, Dr. Chow, like y'all brought it. Y'all brought it, and I'm with it. I don't think I have a lot more to say. Just invite folks to really take the time, whether you have a few moments right after this, or you can create some time later in your day to take some time and try to really be with what was shared with you today. I think there's a lot of information and it can hit you in different ways. So I invite you to think about it. What does it move you to do when you actually think about it and critically sort of engage with it? And then I want you to spend some time being with your feelings around it. The counselor in me is I think that so much can happen when we're able to be deeply in deep reflection around what's discussed. And there were so many voices and perspectives that were shared today. And so what was really coming up for you, please take the time to be with that and allow that to move you to your next most elegant step, as Adrienne Marie Brown says. I look forward to continuing the conversation with anyone who wants to, and I'll drop my information in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the super brilliant women that I got to be on this panel with, and Clayton too. And just my final thought is, I think that we sometimes have a tendency to focus on sort of a deficit model, right? When we talk about what our communities are experiencing and the disparities, and I think it's really important that we take the time to really celebrate the brilliance in our communities, the assets, the histories, the strengths. I think that's a big part of what will create the change that we want to see.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just hearing that people really love this session today. I think the poll says 100% yes. This session did help me become more aware of racism as a public health crisis. So just thank you all for presenting today, because the comments so far say that this is awesome, and I can't wait to see what people think in the survey, which is in the link in the chat. So Jennifer, please share any final thoughts that you have this challenge ahead of us.
My final thoughts really is that I think that we're at a moment where we can heal. I'm very hopeful that we can heal, because to have these conversations and to really just understand that the shift of power, it's a good thing. To allow, the smaller guys, the guys who haven't been heard, the guys who are underserved, the invisible, they can contribute. And from this panel, I just feel this hope, and I know that I hope the takeaway is to reflect and understand that we can take these moments and we can heal.
Yes, thank you. And Miguel is back on. We're just doing final thoughts, Miguel. There's just so much that has been shared.
Yeah.
Do you have any closing comments?
No, I feel like I'm gonna let others do that because I sort of had my interruption here. You know, hey, things happen the way they're supposed to. So y'all did your thing, you do your thing. I'm so thankful for everyone being here today. So Dr. Mosley, Karen, Jennifer, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
And we have 1 more minute left, and I just want to thank everyone. This is actually just a dream come true for me to have you all, to have this series, and to have you all talk about these things here in Orange County. So it's a great foundation for us to move forward with. And I welcome everyone to continue. We have a session November 2nd, 12 to 1:30, where we will be talking about health equity and the social determinants of health, and then another session on December 7th. So please join us. And this is recorded, it's on Facebook, and we look forward to continuing with you.
One more thing,
Yeah.
Ilya,
Yes.
let's put the survey in the chat so folks can fill out the survey just kind of give us.
Done.
Yeah,
He's our research and evaluation director. So yes,
Yeah.
it's done, Miguel.
just want to know what you think. Can someone put, Matt, can you put it in the chat just so folks can go out and fill it out? And there were some comments around just that this was enlightening, heartfelt, amazing, empowering space. Appreciate the incredible conversation. So yeah, so very positive comments coming through. So thank you all. And then if Matt, or Ileana, can you put the survey in there for folks to go to? That'd be great.
Yes.
Thanks
Thank
everybody.
you all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Enjoy.